Jai Shri Ram, Vande Matram, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. I thought I'd had a script in mind, but I think I've forgotten everything. So I'll try and make the most of the time that's been given to me. Rest assured, I don't think I'm going to use this opportunity to sell my book, India That Is Bharat. I think it has sold itself well. I don't need to push it further. So I was trying to make sense of the journey in terms of what is it that I have made of India That Is Bharat. And over the course of the last 3 years, I would say specifically from the pandemic, in fact, I've had a lot of opportunity to think through what I thought I knew and what I clearly don't know. As someone who's been obsessed with the course of public life, or who was obsessed with the course of public life, I think my biggest realization over the last 3 years, at least since 2019, has been that Bharat is not as obsessed with the world outside as it is with the world within. And that perhaps is the journey of reawakening and rediscovery that we may have just about embarked upon. That seems to be my limited realization over the last few years. Each time I try and have a conversation on these issues, somehow even the best of audiences or the best of minds usually get stuck with perhaps the topmost layer of the discussion in terms of the material, in terms of economics, in terms of development. And the hope is someday we are developed enough to go back to the roots of the civilization, which lie in spirituality. As someone who doesn't consider himself even remotely spiritual, at least I have not been blessed with the touch of spirituality yet, I hope someday I speak less about it and I know more about it. As of now, I think I'm in a position only to speak. I don't have the touch of realization yet. I was trying to actually make sense of the distinction between India and Bharat. Ever since I launched that book, I've come under heavy fire for having struck this artificial distinction between India and Bharat. I've even been asked, what is your problem with India? Why do you have such a hatred for India? What is your obsession with Bharat? Are you a bigot? Are you a narrow-minded person? So on and so forth. All sorts of labels have come my way. I think as long as you're stuck with the narrow prism of India, you will never be able to understand the expanse and the ocean that is Bharat. That is my realization. Now, when we speak of India, the unfortunate reality is that it reduces itself to an entity. It reduces itself to a specific nation state. But when you speak of Bharat, it truly represents an idea. It truly represents the confluence of multiple spheres. So for instance, India perhaps is at best a political entity. Bharat is the confluence of 3 levels at the very least in terms of our civilizational realizations at multiple levels. 1, the spiritual. 2 is the social. They culminate into the political, which means politics and political discussion is usually never the starting point of a conversation when you speak of Bharat. No wonder, as Sri Sadhguru mentions, you think of it as a civilization in the first place, and then you try and understand what makes it a civilization. I think over the last 9 years or so, India has been speaking of Hindutva a lot. And as a consequence of India's conversations with Hindutva, the discussion has been heavily political, forgetting that it is merely the topsoil and there is a lot more to this particular land and its culture and its civilization that needs to be revisited over and over again. The journey from India to Bharat is not a journey towards attainment of the so-called status of a superpower, but it is primarily a journey of self-realization and reawakening and rediscovery of our own roots, which I think is the biggest possible challenge that most people whose hearts beat for Bharatiya face, and that's the task that we have cut out for ourselves. I don't think I am interested in convincing the rest of the world of the greatness of this country. My primary challenge is to speak to my own brothers and sisters and try and tell them that this is the culture that you have inherited. And as long as the primary challenge remains, which is to speak with your own people, I don't think there is any further need to speak with the rest of the world. Because I have not been able to convince the home audience, so to speak, of the greatness of the civilization. Every question, rather every statement is followed by a but. It's almost as if doubt is the foremost sentiment when it comes to the greatness of the civilization, which I don't think really bodes well for any aspirations of a Vishwaguru status. If you can't convince yourself of your own greatness, what is the point of trying to convince the rest of the world? It doesn't work. At least not in my limited understanding of human psychology. I don't think that works. So what is it that animates Bharat? How do you define Bharat? Is there a particular concept or a single idea or a single word that can encapsulate Bharat? I would say Rita and Dharma. That's where the buck starts and stops. It starts with Rita, it then comes down to the practicality of Dharma, it goes back to maintenance of Rita. That's what it is. If that is the understanding of Bharat, how do we reduce it down further to its nuts and bolts? Today, the concept of Hindutva or the concept of Bharata, as it obsesses with Vikas in terms of development, it limits itself to a very material definition or paribhasha of development. What is the direct consequence of this reductionist approach to development? We speak of temples, we speak of our kshetras, we speak of our tirthas and our punya kshetras as places of religious tourism. And when a civilization such as Bharat reduces its punya kshetras, its consecrated energy spaces to places of religious tourism, I really don't think it speaks of an upward journey, it speaks of further degradation. Which means it has failed to understand its originality and its original approach to these kshetras, and it has chosen to impose the construct of development and the inherited colonial wisdom to its own sacred spaces. The concept of sanctity takes a back seat. The concept of convenience, facility, and comfort seems to come to the forefront. If you're truly a believer in the concept of Bharata, then you cannot but put stock in the notion and the belief and the lived reality that this land is an energy grid. It's a yantra in itself. Which is perhaps why temples are located where they are. Which is perhaps why before you consecrate that particular space and sanctify it by the invocation of the deity through prana-pratisthana, it is a calculus at work to ask yourself whether this particular space fits in the larger grid. So each time you disrespect Prakriti and you disrespect your devatas, you're not exactly living up to the ideals of your ancestors. And you're bound to be obsessed with the concept of Navanirman. You have no faith in the concept of Punarnirman. If you speak of Navanirman, you effectively divorce yourself from your roots. And if you speak of Punarnirman, you're not clinging on to some past glory, but you're asking yourself, how do I make my values, my inherited values, relevant to my contemporary reality? That is the right question to ask. Which is perhaps the central message that I've tried to convey through the books and my talks. Perhaps replace modernity with originality and indigeneity. That way, you will try and find a balance, which is perhaps the middle path between Navnirman, which seeks to pull down everything from the past, and Punarnirman, which is perhaps the aspiration of a perceived defeated civilization to recreate its past glory without realizing that times may have changed. The truth somewhere lies in the middle, and the hope is that we try and strike a balance between both. One is an absolute hatred for the past and disgust for the past and disdain for the past, and the other is to accept the past lock, stock, and barrel without asking for which is the space in which it is relevant, what are the spaces in which it may or may not be relevant, or it may be relevant in spirit but not in letter. These are questions which perhaps the cultural elites of the current society must obsess with, because these are the questions that are bound to be, or rather we are forced to be answered. We will be forced to be answered each of these questions on a regular basis. I can perhaps give 3 or 4 examples. Hopefully, it should connect with the audience. I'm keeping this conversation as apolitical as possible. I'm trying to keep this conversation as civilizational and as Sanskritic as possible. When you seek to beautify a particular sacred space, I don't think the concept of beautification of a sacred space actually works. Unless and until you understand the sanctity of that particular space, the significance of that particular space, and retaining that particular core, how do you work around everything else to make sure that people have some kind of access, reasonable access to that particular place. But here is another problem. If you happen to be a believer of karma, you happen to be a believer of prarabdha, only then you can call yourself a believer of Sanatana Dharma or a follower of Sanatana Dharma. In which case, unless and until someone gets the call to visit a particular place, they perhaps don't have the prarabdha to visit that place. That is the belief. Every person who believes in the concept of Shakti worship will tell you, jab tak bulawa nahi aayega, you can't go. As simple as that. You can keep making your plans, but unless and until you're asked to visit the place or there is an instruction, you can't go. I don't believe that idea or that notion is limited only to Shakti worship. That applies across the board. So unless and until it is written, you can't go. The unfortunate problem today is that secular obsession with infrastructure and provision of services, that curse has now visited our temples and our sacred spaces. I don't believe that sacred spaces must wallow in dirt. I certainly don't believe that sacred spaces must wallow in poverty. I'm far from making that statement. I'm certainly not making that statement. But I think no sacred space, and I say this with a lot of responsibility, with a fair degree of experience under my belt, and with a fair degree of, let's say, reading on my part before I make this statement, that a sacred space must not be treated as an infrastructure project under any circumstances. Infrastructural obsession with our sacred spaces can perhaps empower political Hindutva, but it can certainly not empower the first 2 planes of Hindutva, spiritual Hindutva and societal Hindutva. So India, that is Bharat, as a journey, cannot limit itself and cannot obsess with political Hindutva alone under any circumstances. Because then the question would be, at the end of the day, what did we gain out of this? Have we gained a reawakened, reinvigorated consciousness which helps us meet the challenges of the day? I'm not so sure. The challenge before us is not a political challenge. It is not even a civilizational challenge. It is a civilization that is deeply doubtful of the strength of the consciousness that it has inherited. It is a consciousness challenge. As long as that consciousness refuses to put stock in the inherited wisdom of its ancestors, which is a product of millennia of trial and error and constant communication with the universe, that is the belief when you speak of Shruti and Smritis. As long as the consciousness refuses to actually consider the possibility that perhaps we know little and they know better or they knew better, as long as that humility doesn't set in, political Hindutva will always be self-edification and an ego massage at best, because it will try and seek to gain brownie points with the other without ever having won the self. Unfortunately or fortunately, human psychology is such that some of these topics and some of these layers may not be accessible to everyone. I'm not being an elitist here. I'm merely saying that there are degrees of communication and there are degrees of the message. The message and the degree at which this particular thought is required to be presented is not easily accessible to everybody else. Then how do you make sure that this message reaches everybody else? Most people learn not the message, but they go by examples. And therefore, every society has evolved the concept of a cultural elite at one point or the other. As much as you keep fighting for democratization of spirituality, the fact is that you do need a certain set of elites. In the Vedic faith system, they are referred to by the name Shishtas. Who are these Shishtas? These are people whose very life is meant to embody the Vedic prescribed way of life, or the Veda prescribed way of life. That is, if you're confused about what is the achara to be observed with respect to a particular practice or a particular circumstance, you look to them for guidance if the guidance is not clear from the text itself. Because at the end of the day, plain and simple text may not be accessible or understandable or intelligible to everyone. You need to see it in action. And therefore, you need a certain set of people who are committed to living that particular way of life and putting it in practice. So the easiest way of perhaps conveying the message and creating a multiplier effect across the board is not to deliver lectures, but to perhaps try and live that life as much as possible to the best of your abilities, regardless of the opposition to it. Increasingly, the core principles are being diluted for greater reach. I don't think you're a great communicator. If you have to dilute the message for somebody to understand it, or if you have to dilute the core for someone to understand it, rather you must find a way to make it accessible without diluting the core. That is the success of a successful communicator. What we are being told in this process of Sabka Saath is that you need to dilute the core. I refuse to buy that. In which case, India's journey to Bharat will remain chimerical, will remain a figment of our pipe dreams and imagination, but it will never attain fructification. It will never become a reality. So don't reduce the bar, don't lower the bar. Find ways of rising up to the bar which your ancestors have already set for you. This civilization has lived in cycles, has died in cycles, has been reborn in cycles. We are perhaps at the cusp of a fresh cycle, hopefully an upward cycle. But even at this stage, there are quite a few fissures and there are quite a few problems and challenges which have already started rearing their heads, which is our fundamental inability to wrap our heads around what this civilization represents. Because we continue to look at the civilization through the sole reductive, narrow prism of politics. It's important that the journey has to be bottom-up and not top-down. So I think it falls upon members of the audience and people who are like-minded, such as this audience, to take back the saransh and the essence of these cogitations and these deliberations and find a way to implement it in their own personal lives, in their own spaces which are within their control, before they seek to change the rest of the society which is beyond their control. Change has to start from within. Namaste.